My name is Brad Hovis, and today's video is going to go over the difference between investing in houses and apartments. I'm going to take a pretty in-depth look at the difference between the two because there's a lot of information out there, particularly right now. Apartment investing, multifamily is incredibly hot right now, but a lot of them don't have the correct information to make the right decisions. And so that's what this video is all about. What I'm going to try to do is break it down in a categorical way. I've got 10 different categories that I'm going to analyze, both investing in a house and investing in an apartment, and you be the judge. You decide what you think is better. Before I get into all this stuff, I want to talk to you about some of my credibility. I have owned apartment buildings. I have owned duplexes. I've built duplexes. I've built quads. I've owned office buildings. I currently own a hotel. So I get the commercial real estate space. So before you in the comment section obliterate me for my lack of knowledge on this subject, I've been there and I've done it. I've not done the incredibly large 100, 200 unit apartment buildings, but the principles really are the same. I have analyzed all of them and I have tried to acquire those properties. It just wasn't good enough deals for me. So without further ado, let's begin. Number one is value. How do you value your investment? A house is valued based on comparable sales in the neighborhood. So for instance, if our house was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,500 square foot brick ranch in a B neighborhood in the middle of the block with a 2-car garage, we want to try to compare recent sales of similar houses just like that. Houses that sold, say, within the last 6 months. That's called a comp. And that's going to explain what the value of your house is. Has nothing to do whether it's occupied or vacant, has nothing to do with whether it has ever been rented and what rent you were able to collect, has nothing to do with how much net rent or how much profit that house made. Simply put, a single family house is worth about what other houses in the neighborhood have sold for. We use the comparative analysis to determine what a single family house is worth. That is not how we determine the value of an apartment building. Now, how you value an apartment building is determined by its profit, its net rent. So how you figure that out is when you collect all the rents, you take out all the rent costs, that's the taxes, insurance, management, maintenance, vacancy. How much profit did it make? What was the net rent? So for instance, if we had an apartment building that once we took out all the rent costs, made $100,000 in profit, and an investor was wanting to get a 10% annual return, also known as a cap rate, was wanting to acquire it at a 10 cap, then this investor would acquire that apartment building for $1 million, knowing that he would every year get a 10% return, which is $100,000. So that would be the value of that apartment. And if other similar apartments in the neighborhood have sold at 10 caps, guess what? That's what your apartment is worth. See, the value is determined in an apartment building based on its performance, because no investor wants to buy a property at a high price with poor performance. Now the argument is going to be, well, Brad, what if the comps in the neighborhood go down? What if the economy takes a dump? Well, if the economy takes a dump in single family, it's also going to take a dump in apartments. It's not a house versus apartment argument, it's an economy argument. The value of a house versus an apartment is wildly different. In the category of value, a house is a much better investment because its value is determined by comps in the neighborhood rather than the performance that can fluctuate from a bunch of different kinds of things. So value is a win for the house. Number two is occupancy. The type of person who wants to live in a single family house typically has a family, wants some space, they don't want to keep moving in and out. If they find the right house in the right neighborhood with the right school district and their kids have friends in the neighborhood, that person who lives in that single family house, that home will stay there long term. The person who lives in an apartment typically has a short-term mentality. Now, some people will argue, wait a second, people in Manhattan have lived there their entire life. There are a couple exceptions. I would say New York City, maybe San Francisco, Chicago. The culture is much more ingrained in the apartment dwelling mentality. But when you think about America in general and across the country, the person who lives in the apartment typically has more of a short-term mentality. The average occupancy of a person who lives in an apartment versus someone who lives in a house, it's night and day. I've owned them both. The people who lived in my duplexes and my quads, man, they were in for 12 months and they were out. I have tenants who lived in my houses for over 10 years. That's a big difference. One stays there for 10 years, the other one stays there 1 year, and I have to keep getting somebody back in there. My vacancy is gonna go up because I'm gonna have to have some time in between tenants to even just carpet and paint. The reason vacancy is a 4-letter word in my office is because vacancy costs. It's a double-edged sword. If we have a note against the property, now we're paying debt while we get no revenue, and we have to fix it up. Actually, that's a triple whammy. All of it still has to get paid whether it's occupied or not. As an investor, you've got to keep people in that house. In fact, one of the criteria, it's not a criteria, it's one of the things that we say to people when they move into our houses is we've got 5 expectations. Number 1, pay your rent on time or early. Number 2, maintain and improve the property and the grounds. Number 3, be a good neighbor. Number 4, stay the rest of your life in the life of your kids. And number 5, leave us alone. See, that's what you can do in a single family house situation. You can tell that person, turn this house into your home. The apartment dweller is someone who comes in, comes out, short-term, vacancy, turnover, maintenance goes up for us as investors. So this second category of occupancy has another nuance to it. And that nuance is about the American dream. A lot of people do their analysis based on Wall Street. I do my analysis based on Main Street. What's going on in the minds and hearts of actual human beings? And once people start having kids, they're gonna wanna move out of that apartment and into a single family house. They don't want to live in that 800-900 square foot box. They want little Johnny to be able to go outside, play on his playground, play in the sandbox, give mama a little bit of relief, and being able to say, hey, we've got the space to hold all the equipment that comes with little Johnny. Additionally, as long as they think puppies are cute, we're gonna keep getting dogs. More people get into my properties because they have dogs, and they want to be able to have that dog go outside, use the facilities out there without them having to put a leash on it and walk it around. When you live in an apartment, you have to put that dog on a leash. You have to take it down to the dog park. You have to have that pooper scooper. If that dog goes to the bathroom 5 times a day, guess who's doing that 5 times a day? You. And there's a lot of people moving from apartments to houses for that kind of a reason. If you had a single family house renting for $1,000 and an apartment renting for $1,000, 9 out of 10 people are gonna go for that single family house. Now let me add another disclaimer to this thing. COVID has changed the trajectory of our work. See, people used to go to apartment buildings because typically those apartments are close to urban areas, and those urban areas are where the jobs are. So that it's close to work, they can walk to work, they can get a quick public transit to work, they can get a cab, if you will. Now let's add COVID to this conversation. Now, you don't have to live close to work because they're working from home. Why would they stay in your apartment building? Why would they want to deal with neighbors above, below, left, right, across the hall, having to pick up their dog poop every single time that dog takes a dump, a crammed apartment for little Johnny? Why would they put up with that kind of stuff? Ultimately, what Main Street wants is their own place to live. They want a front yard, a backyard, a garage, privacy, preferably even a basement. They want their own home. That's the American dream. And whether they're renting it or buying it is immaterial. The product is what they want. And me, as a single family home investor, give them what they want. The apartment building does not. So that's another win, in my opinion, for the home, because you can get long-term people and therefore decrease expenses, increase income, and that's the purpose of being an investor to begin with. So value, the house definitely gets a win. Occupancy is a win for the house. The third category is rehab. When you go and rehab a house, you can get most of your materials from Home Depot. So the rehab on a single family house is typically pretty cheap. And there is some crossover to apartments. Drywall's drywall, cabinets are cabinets, that kind of thing. But where most people don't think about the difference between a house and an apartment is in the major rehab items. The major rehab items like the entire HVAC system, the electric system. When you start dealing in the commercial electric realm, you've got to get a licensed commercial electrician to help you with that. It gets a lot more pricey. If at my house I have my furnace go out, it's gonna cost me $2-3 grand to replace it. What happens when the furnace goes out at your 100-unit apartment building? You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the question is not necessarily the cost difference, though I would argue that I can get major rehab items done on houses cheaper than can be done on the commercial buildings. Why? Because I know that. I own a hotel. It's always more expensive on my hotel than it is on my single family houses because the people who work on commercial are much more expensive. And the question is, do you have the cash to be able to fix up that major issue that happens? Do you have the cash to replace a $200,000 HVAC unit? See, that's much more of an issue for an apartment investor than it is for a house investor. Can I go do $2-3 grand? Yeah, that's no big deal. Even if I had 100 single family houses, what are the chances that all 100 of them are going out? It's not only a risk assessment, it's also a practical assessment. Do I have the capital? Do I have the cash to mitigate that situation? The capital issue of apartments, and that is significant because you can have several $100,000 bills just to keep the thing going. And then the other question is, how much profit do you have to make in order to get that money back? Just from a practical standpoint, apartment investors have to have a large amount of capital as reserves in order to go pay for those major repairs that are coming up. Now, the argument to that is the main argument that apartment people like to deal with, which is debt. They'll talk about, no, I've got a line of credit, I've got this and that, so that if something happens, I can go finance it that way. Well, now what did that just do? It just decreased your cash flow, and then therefore decreased your profit, and therefore the performance is lower, and the whole value of your entire investment went down because you had a major repair that may have not been accounted for, and you got more debt on it, and now it's gonna take 5 years to pay off that debt, and by that time, are you gonna have another major repair? Is the pool gonna go out? How about the jacuzzi? Talk to me about the cost of pools, both at my house and at my hotel. Absolute nightmare. That's just the pools. That's not in talking about elevators, furnaces, the air conditioners. In fact, this is such a good point that I'm making. If you notice some of the new construction, you'll notice that a lot of apartment builders are now building with individual condensing units, air conditioners. They're essentially doing the exact same model that I'm doing with my houses, because each of my house has its own air conditioner. And the reason they're doing that is it's cheaper to change out that air conditioner than it is to change out this gigantic, huge HVAC system that's on the roof that's pushing it all towards every single unit. It's much cheaper changing out one air conditioner than the entire thing at one time. When you've done as many houses as I have, you see a pattern of how people build these houses. And it's pretty standard. Just by seeing one picture of the outside, and I can tell you exactly where most things are. There's an advantage with that. Because houses are pretty much the same, and we can look at each unit as we buy it and do a nice, good visual inspection. We know how much it's going to cost before we buy the property. With apartment buildings, it's unlikely that someone is getting into a 200-unit apartment building that they are looking in all 200 units. They're making assumptions. They are taking one of the largest guesses. When you deal at that scale, just one issue, one thing that you didn't think about, one thing that you're not considering could completely throw your whole rehab budget out the window. You could say to yourself, oh yeah, we want to have all new cabinets. And you thought that there were 6 boxes in those cabinets, and it turns out that there were 8 or 10. Well, you multiply that mistake by 100 or 200, now your rehab budget just went way past whatever reserve you were thinking about as contingency. So rehab and estimating rehab on an apartment building is incredibly difficult. It's a lot easier to estimate rehab on 100 houses than it is to estimate the rehab on a 100-unit apartment building. The rehab definitely goes in favor of houses. So houses get the win on value, occupancy, and rehab. I have been beating up apartments pretty good here and showing how I think that houses are way better investments than apartments. But there are a few categories that I'll get to later that I think apartments way outperform houses. So hang in there. This is part 1. I want to have conversations with you about what I just talked about. So do me a favor, let's discuss in the comment section. And let's have a dialogue about your opinion between apartment investing and single family housing. We'll upload part 2 in a few days. So thanks for watching. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.